Welcome to Teaching Sensitive or Difficult Topics. Difficult conversations can take place when we teach current events or sensitive and controversial topics that students may have strong feelings about, or when students come into our classes thinking about and navigating difficult experiences and events. Some classes taught by graduate students take on sensitive topics from the get-go, as in an international affairs class about a region currently experiencing conflict, an American history class about slavery, or a drama course where a play includes a scene of sexual assault. The subject matter you teach may contain discussions of racism, homo and transphobia, and violence. And even if your course doesn't explicitly feature these topics, they may come up as you decide whether or how to address current events that may be affecting your students, or as students process their own experiences alongside their coursework. In the next few minutes, I will share a guiding framework to help think about teaching sensitive topics from within your position as a graduate student lecturer, and some ways to create an environment conducive to potentially difficult conversations, including increasing predictability and helping students prepare. Teaching does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in context, and thinking about what your context allows for, as well as what obstacles it might pose, will help you prepare to teach sensitive topics. These contextual circumstances are often called situational factors. Everything from this is an 8 a.m. class to this classroom is always really hot to there's a long waiting list for this class and the people who get in are really excited to be there can affect how teaching and learning happens in your class. As a graduate student, your own characteristics are especially significant and may be especially complicated. You might be closer in age to your students or able to relate more fully to their educational experiences since you are still a student yourself. As an instructor, you may not have full control over the material you are teaching or the assessments you will use to gauge students' proficiency. You may also be teaching a course in a field that does not align with your own specialization or experience. If you are able to decide what and how to teach, and are considering whether to include a discussion of a sensitive or controversial topic, think about when you need to decide. For example, you might build a topic into your syllabus, or you might decide to alter your plans because you expect that many students will be affected by an event and will need an opportunity to address it. If you are addressing a topic or event that has arisen, think about how to address it. Do you need to teach to that topic, or are there other ways you can support students, like giving them extra time in class to work on and focus on their schoolwork? You do not need to be an expert in a topic to recognize and compassionately acknowledge how it may be affecting students and to create space for them to tell you what they need in the moment. If you need or decide to teach a topic, consider these questions from Noliwe Rooks. Am I familiar enough with scholarly sources to contextualize the topic or event? Am I prepared to teach students what they don't know but may need to know in order to fully understand the topic? Think, too, about your own well-being. Students are not the only ones affected by discussing sensitive or controversial topics, and the difficulties of doing so are often felt more keenly by people who are already marginalized in one or more ways. Younger, contingent, non-tenured instructors, people who are newer to the institution, people of color, and women and gender non-conforming folks. Allow your own needs, not only your students, to shape your choices. If you have less control over the material in your course, or if discussions of sensitive topics are necessary to fully engage with the topic, consider what you need to feel prepared and reach out to colleagues and peers for support. You might ask someone with expertise to serve as a guest speaker or recommend resources, or you can have a peer review a lesson plan or sit in and observe your class. Keep your situational factors in mind as you think about how you and your students will create a productive climate for difficult conversations. Before these topics even come up, you can lay some important groundwork, starting with your own planning and presence as a teacher. In the classroom, one way to think about this is in terms of sustaining your students' capacity to stay ready to learn. Think about what being stressed out does to your ability to process and retain information. This is true both when dealing with particularly difficult issues and with general system overload. As an instructor, think of your role as preparing students so that they can take the steps they need to tamp down that stress or anxiety response and help them navigate the material. One way to do this is by maintaining clarity about why and how you are teaching what you are teaching. First, consider the relationship that particular material or example has to the course as a whole. How does it tie into the course's goals? Part of that thinking also involves the modes of engagement you plan to use with students. Do you want to have a more open-ended discussion, a more structured conversation, a small group conversation where takeaways are shared more widely, or does it need to be a discussion at all? Sometimes, students judge the risks of discussion as too high. They don't want to be in a position to always have to educate their peers, or they are well-meaning but worry about saying the wrong thing. So activities that let them apply ideas in a more directed way or in a different medium might be more appropriate. You might, for instance, ask students to reflect in writing, then summarize and synthesize the key ideas you see in their responses. Or you might provide ways for students to contribute anonymously by turning in index cards, filling out a Google form, or using polling software. That way you can bring ideas in front of people while lessening the vulnerability of personal sharing. You could also lay out guidelines or boundaries to help keep a discussion respectful and respond if issues occur. For example, you can help students think about how to identify when they are hurt by a comment and how to respond if someone lets them know that they made a comment that was hurtful. For more on helping students prepare and guiding their engagement, see our video on handling hot moments in the classroom. Once you've clarified for yourself what your objectives are in teaching sensitive material and agreed on some principles for operating your classroom, you can explore ways to communicate the material to your students. Because students who know what to expect are best positioned to succeed, you can let them know ahead of time what topics you are discussing and how the readings will approach them. You can help students prepare so they're presenting a considered, thought-through position. One way to think about this is creating different on-ramps and off-ramps to a discussion, ways for students to refine their thoughts, but also to step away and reflect. Before the discussion begins, planning exercises like a free write, a position memo that articulates how a particular set of stakeholders would approach a topic, minute papers where students free write briefly in response to a prompt, or think, pair, share exercises where students reflect, talk to a neighbor, and then share their ideas with a larger group can all help students frame their thoughts. If you're doing a debate or role play, consider randomly assigning positions so students aren't only arguing what they believe in. During the discussion, use question options that invite students to consider different perspectives. For example, what's a counterargument to that position? Another great way to frame that question is, what about my own position gives me pause? What about the opposing position has merit? Or, how will I treat my opponents on this issue? How would I want my opponents to treat me? You could also consider keeping a running list of unresolved questions or questions that are beyond the scope of the conversation. This could go on the board or in a Google Doc accessible to everyone, and it can help focus the conversation, reduce the need for speculation, and flag that you'll come back to some issues later. After the discussion, you can use many of the same strategies you used before. If you need to allow space for reflection, you can do an anonymous exit ticket like a Google form that asks students how it went or suggests next steps, or a minute paper where students write for 1 minute about their key takeaways. As you teach, you can engage with specific moderation strategies designed for sensitive or difficult topics. For example, multi-partial facilitation invites participants to consider which master narratives are present in a situation and to balance them with counter-narratives that might challenge them. For example, say you are discussing attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. The dominant approach is often deficit-based and aimed at helping people with ADHD behave more like neurotypical folks. A counter-narrative to this would be pointing out the strengths that people with ADHD have and asking how those can be brought into an environment, or how the environment can be adjusted to fit them. Another approach is reflective structured dialogue, which originates in religious studies. The crux of this is to focus not on persuading others, but on understanding where they're coming from. So instead of asking students to develop an opinion or take a position, you can ask them to share a story using questions like, how did you arrive at your viewpoint? What experiences have led you to hold this position? You can also think about your role as a moderator. Consider questions like whether you will share your own views. There are valid reasons to do this and valid reasons not to. For example, you might want to tell students how you arrived at your opinions, but you may be concerned that students will feel uncomfortable disagreeing with you. If you decide not to share a particular viewpoint, think about whether doing so is actually displaying neutrality or whether silence itself is an endorsement of any position. Your situational factors can be especially significant here. For example, if students are affected by a current event that is distant from the subject of your course, you may wish to acknowledge how it might be affecting students without addressing details of the event itself. You can also prepare students to operate within the community you've built in your classroom. You can tell them what they can do to take care of themselves. The more specific, the better. This has a couple components. First, logistics and course policies. Will students' grades be affected if they leave a class session that may expose them to trauma? Are there alternative assignments they can complete? For example, writing a reflection instead of participating in a discussion, or reading about a source rather than reading the source itself. This does not mean that a student can or should always withdraw from a given reading or activity. Sometimes there's a rationale for students to face something even if it makes them deeply uncomfortable. So think about language like this as an invitation to a process. You can ask students to work with you, to avoid using their previous experiences to assess your class, and to have a conversation about what an alternative form of engagement can look like. You can also think about this in terms of physical care. Especially when a student is in a place of emotional dysregulation, a calm and grounding presence can be helpful to them. You can invite them to engage in the strategies they've developed to deal with difficult moments. You are likely not a trained counselor, and you are certainly not your student's counselor, but you can share information about more general support resources in the campus and the community, particularly when it comes to mental health. Even if students have a sense that resources exist, your involvement can give them the nudge they need to access them. You could, for instance, offer to pair a student in distress with someone who can walk them over to the counseling office, or to sit with a student while they write an email or make a phone call to get access to services they need. Teaching sensitive or difficult topics can be a challenge, but acting in accordance with your specific circumstances, preparing students for what to expect, and connecting them with support can make these teaching moments among the most worthwhile and rewarding parts of your role.